The United Nations General Assembly has convened in New York, and the biggest news, at least from the Israeli perspective, revolves around Palestinian statehood. On the one hand, major world powers, including France, Britain, and Canada, are set to recognize a Palestinian state, throwing their support to the Palestinian Authority, an entity born of the PLO terrorist organization, which continues, to this day, to pay terrorists for killing Jews and Israelis. Within Israel, questions remain as to the proper response. Maybe it's expelling consulates and withholding visas for European NGOs. Maybe it's limiting Israeli financial and security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. Or, as some have suggested, maybe it's annexing major swaths of Judea and Samaria. The only clear sentiment, broadly shared, is that these unilateral recognitions cannot go unanswered, and that they signal an end to the peace process, which was just as unilateral on Israel's side. At this moment, the only major power signaling its resistance to this wave of state recognitions is the United States. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is one of around 80 Palestinian officials who've been barred from attending the UNGA as the U.S. has denied him a visa on national security grounds. Specifically, the U.S. has said that it is in its national security interests to hold the PLO and the PA, quote, accountable for not complying with their commitments and for undermining the prospects for peace. Critics of the move suggest that it's a violation of international law. Today, on Basic Law, we're pleased to welcome former legal advisor to the U.S. State Department and former federal judge Abraham Sofaer to understand better the law and diplomacy on this issue. Welcome, Judge Sofaer.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so we have this story from the recent past about the visa denials for the 80 officials from the Palestinian Authority, including President Mahmoud Abbas. I want to actually zoom out before we go into the law on visa denials and talk about this long-standing story of the American approach to the PLO and to the Palestinian Authority. You had significant experience with it while at state and followed it for many years. And maybe you can walk us through some of that.
I'll try. It's very complicated. Our approach has been a little bit divided in the sense that it's not entirely consistent in any way, either temporally or ideologically. We are all opposed to the PLO committing terrorist acts or authorizing them, or any person committing a terrorist act, killing Americans, etc. One answer to that was not to have any communication with the PLO. And we were, despite that, allowing the PLO to participate in UN proceedings under the headquarters agreement in the 1980s. And an election occurred. George Shultz was preparing to leave the State Department as secretary, and a new president was going to be George H.W. Bush. And Shultz decided that he would deny a visa to Arafat because of Arafat's involvement in specific terrorist murders. And this was very extremely, in fact, controversial. Many European countries criticized us. We were sued in the ICJ. I expected to lose there, and I told the secretary we would lose because the headquarters agreement requires us to allow representatives, and we weren't in a position to prove that Arafat was guilty of a murder easily. It would have taken a long time. The fact of the matter is that the denial of the visa led to a couple of countries getting together with Arafat and saying, well, why don't you admit that Israel has a right to exist and that you don't believe in terrorism and that you will not commit any more terrorist acts or authorize them. And they made a lot of progress. They went ahead with a meeting in Geneva, as sort of we'll teach you for not letting Arafat into New York. But the fact of the matter is, Arafat wanted to come to New York. And we got Arafat to um, abs- accept the right of Israel to exist. I don't know how much that means in terms of reality, but it was a big step forward in two ways. Number one, it got the world's attention to the fact that Arafat was being excluded for killing people, especially U.S. diplomats. Um, and secondly, it um, made something out of that. In other words, if he could come to the U.S. and participate in the UN, even though he had killed two ambassadors or had arranged the killing of two ambassadors, that would um, that was a certain posture for the U.S. to take, and it was one that Schultz did not like. On the other hand, Schultz also did not like not communicating with PLO. So Schultz thought it was better to insist that there's certain conduct that's unacceptable and you can't come to America if that's what you're going to do. But on the other hand, that if you do accept the proposition that you're not to kill diplomats and civilians, we will talk to you. And so it was very dramatic. And despite everybody's criticism, oh, why are you doing this? You're going to disrupt the whole thing. It was the opposite of disrupting. He said the words, and he then opened a dialogue. It was not an important dialogue at that point because, you don't jump into a meaningful dialogue with someone you haven't talked to for years, especially Arafat. But it was a dialogue, and Bush liked that, actually. He did not like what Schultz had done, but he liked the outcome, and so did most people. So it was a good lesson, I thought, and one which we tend to forget. I think it's very important that we exclude people who uh, killed Americans or did something unacceptable. Very important, and Congress has made that clear. We shouldn't be waiving these requirements. But it's also important that we maintain diplomatic relations at the proper level and with all groups, including groups we despise, who despise us. And there's no reason we can't be very tough with a group that we are at the same time talking to. And so that's basically the background of that. That is that we do have the power under the headquarters agreement, and we have the authority and the responsibility under law to exclude people who have harmed Americans and who would be a threat to the U.S. if they were allowed to come into the U.S. But that's our reading of the headquarters agreement. Whether that would be upheld, I don't know, but I think that it's well established that that's our reading.
So, in addition to that story, which was like a pivotal one in the relationship between the U.S. and the PLO, there's also been a number of congressional statutes. I mean, the PLO is classified still as a terrorist organization in the states. There's been recent legislation clarifying that legislation before that has has basically opened the PA and PLO to suit for attacks against Americans anywhere that they might be in the world. There was another episode, I think, with you in the State Department relating to the closure of the PLO missions. This was obviously before Oslo. I think in a way what's happened now with the State Department denying the visas, there are critics of it that draw on the headquarters agreement, and then the State Department basically points to two statutes where the PA has commitments relating to the Israeli right to exist and, most importantly, the cessation of terrorism, for which it continues to pay. And it seems like maybe this is the first measure in what could be more measures as the world moves to try and legitimize a Palestinian state.
Part of the world is moving toward that, as they always are, and they always have been. That was the case then. The underlying problem is that the Palestinians have made a gravely incorrect calculation of their interests. They think that by being anti-Israel and killing Jewish people and Americans, they are somehow maintaining their strength and maintaining their cause, whereas they are losing, steadily losing, and power and leverage. And Israel is steadily increasing its determination, regardless of the opinions of other states, to take over areas where Palestinians are attacking Israel, including Gaza. So the overall calculation since 1918 is overwhelmingly clear that by not accepting the Jews, and that continues to be the case, the Palestinians have lost ground repeatedly and will lose ground again, in my opinion.
Can I ask you to clarify the loss of ground? Because I could let's say I could make a different case. I could say, look, there are even before the recognitions, the new recognitions that have been promised go through, there are 147 countries that recognize a state of Palestine. Put aside the fact that it would be very hard to explain on what territory it sits and, what form of government it has, all sorts of other critical elements. So there's 147 countries that recognize. There's now major countries in the West that are going to move to recognize unilaterally. And, they've been legitimized, essentially, one could argue. But it sounds like you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that all of that is kind of noise compared to what's going to happen with security-based expansion, in your view?
It isn't just noise; it's nasty noise. um, the fact is that it's still only noise. The the reality has to be examined. And what is the reality? The reality is a continually diminishing amount of territory, a continually aggravated relationship in which occasional murders of Israelis are committed and followed by deaths, destruction, horrendous destruction by Israel of Palestinian areas from which these murderers arrived, and the gradual loss of power. And most important, probably, is the fact that, I remember very well when I was in the State Department that over a majority of the people of Israel were ready to accept a Palestinian entity of some kind. Today, that's inconceivable. The Palestinians have lost the biggest potential ally they could have had in the Israeli people. Um, Certainly, Netanyahu's position on a Palestinian state has transformed from when he was a young, um, same guy, but different facts. It's just further down the road, and they've insisted on going on with their effort to destroy and destabilize Israel, and also their effort to delegitimize Israel, which many states, regrettably, might play along with, um, on the rationale that they're helping the poor um, Palestinians. But even those Jews who want to help the Palestinians, who like Palestinians, who feel Palestinians, particularly myself, I'm a Middle Eastern Jew, and I have always gotten along well with the Palestinian leaders that I've known that are reasonable and rational. And then I met them in Israel and many times here. And I regard the Palestinian people, and they prove it over again when they leave Palestinian areas, and they come to America or South America or Central America, they do very well, and they work hard, they succeed, they become big players where they are. I think what they are losing is huge. The biggest thing they're losing is the sense that this really was possible, that the Jews and Palestinians could live together in two states. I don't get that feeling that anywhere near half the Israeli population accepts that anymore.
No, I think at this point, well over half would um, suggest that a two-state solution is uh, either unwise, but probably mostly impossible.
Yeah,
As far as the
that it
surveys that
isn't just
I've read.
accepted. I mean, it's deeply uh, ingrained in a public that has learned the hard way that the Palestinians don't want peace with a Jewish state. Um, and that may not be true of all Palestinians, but in terms of the practice and and uh, conduct of Palestinians and their leaders, um, it's been very sad, very ineffective. Opportunities have been missed, and I don't know how many more opportunities there are.
It sounded like you think it may be time for even more executive action on the American side as far as
Definitely.
communicating. Okay, well, what would that
Yeah, I
look like?
think denying visas is fine, but we still give a lot of money to the Palestinians, and a lot of countries are giving money to them, and many countries are still supporting UNRWA, even though they have been shown to be a biased and untrustworthy agency. There's a lot to be done that's far more substantive, and we have to um, support Israel's refusal to allow UNRWA to operate in, and also Israel's need to have security. Um, it's there's more than ambiguity to the situation vis-a-vis European states. They really do, um, after a murder of Jews and whatnot, that Israeli retaliates, and they really then do go back to opposing Israel. And it's a dance that really doesn't lead anywhere good. They need to really be firm about the end of violence by the Palestinians, so that the Palestinians can make some progress. Because I think they would make progress if they stopped being violent and were more cunning, if you will, more clever about their interests, more willing to get educated, have good economies, uh, show that they really want trade. They'd like an airport, um, and they have to earn that in the sense that they have to prove that they're not going to use it for terror. And there's no way you can earn that now. It's just not possible. It's so far from that, um, that it's inconceivable to most people. But it was conceivable. It might be conceivable again. I doubt it. But that really is what's needed, not little sanctions here and there or visa denials. The U.S. really has to come to grips with the fact that, and I think this administration's well on the way, you have to come to grips with the fact that you cannot live with Hamas. You cannot live with an organization devoted to the destruction of Israel. It doesn't. It's not possible.
So you mentioned this administration. My impression has been that so this administration obviously has at the top, and other more right-leaning administrations, I would suggest, probably had at the top of the State Department individuals that share the kind of worldview that you're describing right now. But the bureaucracy of the State Department has always been pointed in a different direction. And you can shed more light on that than I can, but and I hope you will. But I'm just wondering how you see the future of that dynamic playing out, right? Because we're talking, if it's about this administration taking the right steps, then on the assumption potentially that things could change in a few years, that bureaucracy remains. And what does American foreign policy look like?
Well, those are very complicated questions because there's no doubt that the State Department personnel, being in the thousands that are relevant to this question, are going to vary in terms of their personal opinions. But most of them are professional, and with leadership, they fall into line and they do the work that they're supposed to do. I don't get the impression that Rubio is soft on the Palestinians at all. I think he's been absolutely on target and correct. And the president is also, while he was said some uh, critical things about the invasion attack by Israel, the recent attack. Um, the fact is that he does believe in the destruction of Hamas, and there's no other way to destroy Hamas's capacity. They have been offered the opportunity to leave, and ultimately that would be the most humane result, and one that I would certainly support. And I think, of course, the President Rubio would support that. So I don't know. I mean, I think that what you've got here is a what's become is it's a cultural, um, devastatingly uh, harmful cultural separation of the two people that in the 1980s um, wasn't conceivable until the first Intifada, which happened during that my when I was in the State Department, and that became a sort of a rallying call for this kind of conduct. Um, and together with the corruption and the uh, heart and the you know the force that's used by Hamas to keep any Palestinians in line who might step out of line and say, "Hey, listen, this is crazy. We need to get along with the Israelis and do something for ourselves." It's really I don't know how you can turn this around at this point without getting the Hamas out of Gaza completely. And I don't know how you do that other than this kind of massive destruction and all the enmity that that's going to cause. So we're not in a good time, not at all. And I don't think the consequences are going to be good for any kind of rapprochement. The consequences might be quite good for security, but at a huge price on both sides.
Um, how do you see Israel's positioning globally right now when you're talking about prices?
Well, the Israelis have learned not to care too much about the opinions of various European states or very other states. Certainly, we don't care about the opinions of Russia and China and Korea, for example, North Korea. We don't care about the opinion of Iran. Um, for good reason. Israelis don't care about the opinion of France. Mr. Macron, he may have some decent words to say about this or that, and he certainly may have some good feelings that he wants to transform into reality and um good. But um, the some of the statements he and other European leaders have made, not so much the Germans, but other European leaders have been ignored and will continue to be ignored because the Jewish people, on the basis of a lot of bad experience, have learned that they have to make these decisions for themselves. And it's good to have allies. It's great to have the US on our side. And there's no threat of withdrawing weapons and all this other stuff, as you might have had with Joe Biden or some other kind of leader, certainly Kamala Harris. We have instead an administration that's not going to do that. They realize that Israel's security was grievously threatened by murderous people who not just killed soldiers, but murdered babies and women and raped people. And this kind of thing is not forgotten. Uh, the October attack has had a huge impression. Yeah, it's a very hard time to make progress. And what it has needs to be recognized as that, and because you can't get the items in shape in the right kind of lineup to permit meaningful engagement without seriously thinking about the realities, uh, and that's what needs to happen.
So you talk about reality, and as I've been reading the news, I've seen kind of this potential circus playing out. I don't think that the Israelis will actually declare, I mean, obviously speaking in my very personal capacity and not for the forum, which does not deal in the politics of these matters, but I suspect that Israel will not actually annex the territories that some of its ministers have suggested that we do. Uh, and yet there's a lot of pressure to do something big in response to these, what you're basically suggesting, I think, is noise, nasty noise, I think it was.
Well, I don't think it's in response to the noise. It's unfair to Israel. It's in response to the reality of an enmity that's so deep and continuing. And the response that's suggested of annexation is really inconsistent with Israel's conduct ever since they tried to have a little small homeland near the Arab homeland, the Palestinian homeland. And namely, the expansion, generally speaking, in terms of annexation, I'm not talking about some kind of control for security, has been driven by actual uh, Jewish settlement. And I think that we need to remind Israel of that the Israel has not acted as a world power seeking domination over some group that they managed to defeat. Israel has acted historically uh, as expanding its sovereign territory to reflect the fact that Jews have moved into settlements that are close to or attached, literally, mainly attached to the existing lines of Israel. So I don't think Israel is close to populating the West Bank or populating Gaza. However, it may well be that Israel needs to annex pieces of Gaza as a security zone. Now, that is something that I would think, you know, people may oppose it, but this has some functional value. If you're going to have Jews living in settlements near the Gaza border, you don't want them to be murdered again. They were murdered by people who came across in trucks and buses and vans and mindlessly murdered. So we don't want that to happen again. The U.S. doesn't want it to happen again. Israel doesn't want it to happen again. So when you're talking about annexation, there may well be some legitimate forms of annexation that are consistent with Israeli historical practice. And that is areas that are necessary for Israel's security, given the behavior of the Palestinians.
That went in a slightly different direction than I anticipated, but um, I learned a lot from the response. So thank you. So I was going to ask actually about sort of warring, unilateral recognitions, because the Americans have also signaled that they're not going to stop Israel if Israel does it. If Israel does it, of course, is a big if. And so you'd have these like conflicting recognitions of territorial claims in the same space that meant what legally and diplomatically.
Well, that's old stuff. I mean, that's been going on for years and years. We've made the point that they don't have the reality of a state. The requirements of statehood have not been met by the Palestinians. But some states want to show that they are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and you can understand why they feel that way because the Palestinians have suffered so much. They really need to do more to have a better leadership for the Palestinians, and maybe less by just giving less money to them when they're not behaving rationally. Because the Europeans are giving hundreds of millions of dollars to Palestinians, even as they are grotesquely behaving in this manner. Um, and the U.S. too has been too supportive. So the world has to really decide in a serious manner: do they really want these two groups to behave properly toward each other and take actions that are consistent with that, rather than being distracted by seemingly meaningful and warm and humane instincts of wanting to help the poor and the defeated and the destroyed and the all these things, which everyone feels, every decent person in the world wants to do that. But if you're just doing that in order to have yet another repeat of the same kind of conduct with the same result, incidentally, where the Palestinians lose some some element or some territory or something, it doesn't make sense.
All right, I have one last question. Do we have time?
Sure. Sure.
Okay. So this particular topic, the reason that you were invited initially, was that there was this amazing story that you were involved in at State, which involved Kurt Waldheim. Um, and of course, so what triggered the connection was visa denial, right? And I was wondering if you could give a bit of background about that story, just to cap off. It's not directly related to what we've been discussing, but it does give some background as to some of the legal and diplomatic considerations, and it's a good story. So I'd like to end with that, if you're all right with it.
Sure. We were um, forced by the fact that there was talk about his coming to the U.S. I I don't think he got to.
You may need to remind people who Kurt Waldheim was.
Well, he was the president of Austria, and he was uh, a former Nazi, which is what we were finding out more and more about him. He had been Secretary General of the United Nations, and either we didn't know enough, or there are some people who knew and didn't mind. But anyway, he had been Secretary General, and there were people in the Department of Justice. Uh, there, uh, there were certainly Meese and his people, including Alan Gerson, who passed away years ago, but he was in charge of the U.S. relationship to former Nazis. And there was Mary Moshari in the State Department, who was my chief assistant in the legal advisor's office, and George Schultz, obviously, and myself. And the work began in earnest on finding out the background of Kurt Waldheim in order to determine whether we would how we would respond to a request that he be allowed to come to U.S. And there were a lot of people who supported him here, uh, but they also didn't know the full history of his background. But we developed that background, and it was clear that he had played meaningful roles um, as a Nazi, uh, as a soldier who was supporting the Hitler regime that were not known, um, and that he knew a lot more. Clearly, must have known a lot more about the persecution of Jews and others, gypsies, other people that the Nazis hated. And so we issued an opinion that was cleared by both the Department of Justice and the Department of State and approved by the president. making clear that he would not be permitted to enter the United States. It was very controversial, but um, it was, I thought, absolutely correct. And we need to consider the importance of being honest with ourselves about who we are supporting. I mean, he would not have been Secretary General of the United Nations if the U.S. had opposed his appointment. As a permanent member, we would have been able to block that. We must be really aware and study harder and be more principled in the exercise of our power if we want to really change the world.
I think that's a good place for us to end
Sure.
tonight. And I hope that we can have you back in the future. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.